Adolf Hitler has been dead for more than 70 years. At the end of World War II, the official story is he committed suicide in a Berlin bunker when he realized that he was not going to win the war. But what if, some way, somehow, Hitler was resurrected? How would our modern society react to Hitler returning? Would they love him? Would they hate him? Surely there is no way that our society would allow Hitler to gain power again. Or would they? Today, Life's Biggest Questions asks, what if Hitler came back to life? Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions, the channel that questions the impossible. I'm Charlotte Dobre, and if you're fascinated by World War II, hit that like, subscribe, and notification bell. If you want to connect with creatives behind Life's Biggest Questions, our social media accounts are posted in the description of this video. What if Hitler came back to life? Maybe you've never asked yourself that question because there's no way it would be possible with our current technological capabilities. So how would Hitler come back to life in the first place? Well, maybe a mad scientist did some sort of Frankenstein-y experiment that resurrected Hitler. Maybe Hitler never died and was cryogenically frozen, only to be brought back to life in the modern day. After Hitler committed suicide, his body was burned. This led to some speculation as to whether or not Hitler could have escaped and lived out the rest of his life. In 2009, some of the remains were tested, and they belonged to a woman who was 40 years old or younger. Last time I checked, Hitler is not a woman. So it's entirely possible that Hitler did not pass away the way history has written it. But for the purposes of this video, let's not think about the specifics and dive right in. If Hitler came back to life, he would come back to a very different world, culturally speaking. Germany in the 1930s and 40s was a place that erected for prejudice and violence. Germany is very different now. Hitler would be shocked to find out that Jews had become essentially one of the most powerful groups of people in the United States. Poland still exists, and much of what he achieved during his time as the Führer has been erased. He would hate the current Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel. The rest of the world is very different too. Culturally, technologically, our world is very diverse now. It's likely Hitler would not approve of what our world has become if he returned to modern day. A film about Hitler waking up in modern day Berlin was one of the biggest movies in Germany in 2015. The film is called Look Who's Back. It's based on a novel by the same name by Timur Vermes, and it examines what would happen if Hitler returned to Germany in modern day. In Look Who's Back, Hitler magically reappears in a housing project in East Berlin, close to the infamous bunker where he took his own life. Hitler ends up meeting a TV producer, and he decides the best way to come to power is to become a TV personality. The film would document real-life interactions between the man playing Hitler and ordinary Germans. Of course, these ordinary Germans didn't think this man was actually Hitler. They thought he was a comedian or a method actor dressed up as Hitler. But Hitler would ask the people he met in public what their problems were and use them to his advantage. Things like the foreigners who are arriving from outside the country. What the filmmakers of Look Who's Back realize is how easily ordinary people would tell a man dressed as Hitler their issues. In one scene, Hitler persuades a group of soccer fans to attack someone making anti-German comments. According to the filmmakers, it was extremely easy to convince the soccer fans to beat up the person making anti-German comments. Hitler then appears on a TV show called Whoa Dude, where he goes off script in order to broadcast his views. The video of his rants do extremely well on YouTube, and Hitler becomes a celebrity. You might think that in this day and age, there's no way history would repeat itself. We live in a far different society than that of Germany. We must have learned from the horrible atrocities committed by Hitler. But as we have seen with the film Look Who's Back, it's entirely possible to provoke people, and possibly the masses, to do something horrible by playing on their fears. According to one review of the film, it was as if Hitler never really left. Maybe Hitler wouldn't be able to commit mass in this day and age, but it's entirely possible that he could rise to power, especially with regards to today's political climate. There are far-right neo-Nazi movements that have gained traction in both the United States and in Europe who could be looking for a leader like Hitler. But then things could also go an entirely different way. If Hitler came back to life and the world found out about it, he could finally be brought to justice. In most places, however, capital punishment has been abolished. In Germany, the current constitution forbids capital punishment. For this reason, it's likely that Hitler would be sent to a maximum security prison for life. Of course, if Hitler came back to life, everyone is probably going to be wondering how that could be possible in the first place. The person who brought him back to life would also be brought to justice as well, as they likely violated ethics laws in doing so. And then the technology to resurrect people would now be available. But maybe that's a topic for another Life's Biggest Questions. But as always, the discussion doesn't end here. I open the question to you, dear subscribers. What do you think would happen if Hitler came back to life?
What if Hitler was brought back to life in 2021? There's a lot of options here, and almost none of them look good for Hitler because things are not the same in 2021 as they were almost 100 years ago. Not even close. If Hitler was brought back to life in 2021, let's just say that he was brought back at the age he died at. Because at this point, if he somehow faked his own death and managed to shave his mustache and live a normal life all this time, he would be 132 years old, which would mean he probably isn't in the greatest shape health-wise, but that would also make him the oldest person to have ever lived, and even before his death, it was rumored that he was falling ill. These rumors include talks of things like an advanced stage of Parkinson's, so if this really was the case, we'd of course have to study him and stuff because the oldest man ever equals a scientific anomaly, or he's immortal, or he's a time traveler? Let's just for a second think about if a 132-year-old Hitler appeared, because, well, we can. He probably wouldn't be in a great frame of mind because, well, the whole old age thing. If this were the case, it's unclear on whether or not he would end up standing trial for his crimes. Not only would doctors and scientists be extremely interested to find out how he had lived that long, and it's extremely likely he would be the subject of plenty of medical tests, but he may not be able to stand trial due to the lack of an ability to follow the proceedings. If this was the case, it is very likely that he would be placed in some sort of facility until he died or was killed. This is under the assumption that his mind isn't doing well at 132 years old, but if he was somehow still fully competent, then there would be no real reason for him not to stand trial for the things he did. And that would be a celebrated day. If he came back at 132 years old, there's definitely no way he would be able to try and resume what he was once doing. He would be threatening to absolutely no one and would probably need assistance just to get out of bed in the morning. Not exactly dictator qualities. If Hitler somehow came back to life at the age he died at, like if he was frozen in time and somehow reappeared, what happens right after really depends on where in the world he reappeared. In a lot of places, it's likely he would be killed. Almost immediately. Like, no one would kill a guy just for looking like Hitler, but if it ended up being confirmed somehow, it is highly likely that he wouldn't even make it to trial because the people would get him first. If he was killed by the people, it's also likely that nothing would happen to those who took part in the crime. Authorities would likely turn a blind eye because it's in everyone's best interest for someone like that to remain where he's been for the last 70-something years. In other places, it's more likely he wouldn't be killed and instead he would spend a great deal of time answering the number of questions people have for him. The questions would range from things like ideological questions to historical questions to militaristic questions, and I mean the list just goes on. Think to yourself right now, if you were sitting there with him and you could only ask him questions, you'd have an unbelievable amount of things to question him about, because how does someone do the things he did? How does someone become that evil? Does 2021 Hitler still think like the old one? There would be no shortage of questions. That's for sure. Unfortunately, there are some people in this world, if he did come back, who would think of him as some sort of messiah and would send adoring letters and gifts to him. Thankfully, this is likely a small number of the population, but still, it's uncomfortable to acknowledge that people out there like that do exist. In the off chance he wasn't killed immediately, he would definitely stand trial, similar to the Nuremberg trials, which were the trials that took place between 1945 and 1946, in which 24 of the most important political and military leaders of the Third Reich were tried for their crimes. The outcome of the trial would probably be a death sentence, which I don't think I have to explain, unless this trial took place in a country or area where the death penalty doesn't exist, and in those cases he would likely spend the rest of his life locked up in prison. During the trial, there would be a plethora of things that come out. He would have to explain how everything happened, he would have to answer for the crimes he committed, he would have to detail his plans, his goals he never got to see come to fruition. We would hear a lot about the things we don't know and the things we can all be glad never happened. There is the possibility if he woke up and was found by authorities in a country before the general public knew, he might be granted asylum. I'm not sure which country would do this, but for the sake of asking the question, I'm just trying to cover all possible angles here. At this point, he would never be able to leave that country because the minute he does, it's over from there. If he awoke in a country or somehow found himself in a country that was not granting him asylum, he would be arrested and never let out again, so this is basically the only chance he would have at any type of freedom. If he was living in a place where he wasn't going to be executed for his crimes, he would likely be allowed to live a free life. well, as free of a life as he could live, because just imagine the death threats and the assassination attempts that would be coming his way. It is very likely that wherever he lived would need to be heavily guarded, and he probably wouldn't be able to move around a lot and go to a lot of places. Even sorting his own mail would be dangerous. Basically, he would not have a normal life either way, in or out of prison. He would be locked up and guarded with little to no mobility. If a young Hitler were to enter our world now and try to do the things he once did, he would have little to no success for a few reasons. Firstly, it has been noted that he was a great orator, but an orator does not a world leader make. Not anymore. A lot of Hitler's success was due to the circumstances at the time, particularly the circumstances Germany was in. After World War I, the German economy and government were both struggling greatly. This was due to the Treaty of Versailles, which was the most important peace treaty which helped end World War I. The reason this treaty was an issue for Germany was because part of it stated that Germany had to accept the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all of the loss and damage during the war. This article, which was Article 231, went on to become known as the War Guilt Clause, and it ended up meaning that Germany had to disarm, make territorial concessions to places like France and Poland, and pay reparations to certain countries. These payments were assessed to have been around 132 billion gold marks, which is about $442 billion US in today's money. That is an insane amount of money. These reparations completely destabilized the German economy and caused mass amounts of inflation. In September of 1923, 4 billion German marks held the equivalent value of $1 American dollar. A lot of people would argue that this treaty was way too harsh and actually counterproductive, but in that same respect, people on the Allied forces side would go on to criticize the treaty for being too lenient. At the end of the day, we aren't here to talk about our feelings about the treaty, so let's get back to our question. Because of this precarious situation Germany was in, Hitler, who was a great speaker, would address in political meetings that Germany needed a new order to replace what he saw as an incompetent and inefficient democratic regime. This is when his ideas of the new order, which was the authoritarian political system, began to come out. How did race get brought into this? That's a wonderful question that we'll have to save for another video, but we all know what happened from here on out. Hitler's rise to power could in part be chalked up to the situation Germany was in, but considering that is not how things are going in Germany here in 2021, the same sort of thing would be implausible. Not impossible, but highly unlikely. Hitler saw an opportunity when Germany was in a vulnerable spot, and he took advantage of it. If Hitler was brought back to life in 2021, he certainly would not live even close to the life he once did, if he even had the chance to continue on living. We are all extremely aware of this specific dark spot in our world history, and there is no way he would ever be in a position of power again. All we can do is be thankful that he will never be brought back to life, and remember these times and how they happened so that we can ensure something like it never happens again.
Adolf Hitler is one of the most infamous dictators of all time. He was the man behind one of the most terrible eras of modern history, and the instigator behind some truly awful war crimes. Unfortunately, the world never received the necessary amount of closure, as instead of having to answer for his crimes and face the necessary punishment, Adolf Hitler, his wife Eva Braun, and a few other prominent members of the Nazi Party killed themselves. But what if he hadn't? What if he escaped? Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions, the channel that loves to delve deep into a multitude of topics because we believe that curiosity didn't kill the cat, it only made it wiser. I'm your host Rebecca Felgate, and today I'm asking, what if Hitler escaped to Argentina? Adolf Hitler died in his Führer bunker on the 30th of April 1945 as a result of a self-inflicted gun wound. His body was then burned in the garden behind the Reich Chancellery. It seems that the dental records strongly uphold the likelihood of this narrative. However, with a lack of body from the most controversial figure of World War II, a lot of people suspected he may have escaped. British authors Simon Dunstan and Jared Williams wrote a book called Grey Wolf: The Escape of Adolf Hitler, in which they perpetuated the conspiracy theory that actually he fled to Argentina. So, what if he did? Well, the scenario in Grey Wolf paints the picture pretty well. U-boats took prominent figures and literal boatloads of money to Argentina, where they were supported by the future president Juan Perón, who did indeed express support for fascism in the form of Hitler and Mussolini in the late 1930s. So even if Hitler had made the escape to Argentina, how successful would that have even been for him? He would have had to assume a new identity and live his life in hiding. Wouldn't he have been found eventually? Well, if his underling Adolf Eichmann is anything to go by, then yes he would. Adolf Eichmann was a Nazi SS leader and one of the key players in the and instigators of the final solution. He escaped to the so-called disgraced murderer mecca of Argentina and was eventually found by the Israeli Secret Service. He was executed in Israel, which many saw as justice served. Hitler was obviously far more recognizable and sought after than Eichmann, so it's likely that had the Allies or the Zionists had ever any suspicion of Hitler dwelling in Argentina, they would have extensively searched for him and found him. Had he been found, it would have been political chaos for the South American country, who would be complicit in harboring one of the world's most wanted fugitives. People high up must have known. We know that Argentina went to war with the Falklands in the 1980s, but had the nation been complicit in hiding Hitler, then they would have had to deal with a rain of political fire from other countries. Perhaps it would have sparked an Argentinian-Israeli war. Either way, had Hitler been found, he almost undoubtedly would have been tried and killed. This offers problems in itself though. Hitler was hated by many people. The Allied forces, especially Britain and France, would have wanted justice, but so too would the Jewish people. Depending on when he was found, he could have been tried and killed in Israel, the settling place for many displaced European Jews, or he could have been sent back home and tried in the fatherland of Germany. I personally think had Winston Churchill been alive when he was found, he would have wanted to crucify the man himself. Either way, it would have been huge world news. So what if Hitler escaped to Argentina and survived though? Well, he would definitely be dead today. He was born in 1889, so assuming he lived a then average lifespan, he likely would have died in and around the 1960s or 70s. If that was the case, he would have lived to see the aftermath for Germany. It wasn't so great. The mess, the sadness, the rebuild, and the division into East and West, the Berlin Wall. He would have seen Russian strength grow, which would have frustrated Hitler no end. He also would have lived to see the formation of Israel and the revival of Jewish prominence. He would have lived to have seen his name and legacy spurned. He would have lived to have known that he failed. But, again, the likelihood is that he didn't. All evidence points to the death of the Führer in the Führer bunker. We will never know how the world could have been different had he survived. Would it have been for better or for worse? Well, let me know what you think, guys. I'm looking forward to reading the comments in the comment section down below.
Adolf Hitler was the instigator of one of the most devastating conflicts the world has ever seen. On top of that, he was the driving force behind an ethnic cleansing program that saw the mass genocide of around 11 million people. A lot of people were understandably happy when he died. Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions. Are you guys subscribers to our channel yet? If you aren't, then hit that big red button. I'm Rebecca Felgate, and today I'm asking, what if Hitler were alive today? The story goes that when Adolf Hitler, leader of the notorious Third Reich, knew that he was not going to win the war, he killed himself. Knowing the Soviet army were nearby and coming for him, he retired to his Führer bunker in Berlin and shot himself with a Walther PPK 7.65 pistol. His wife, Ava, is said to have taken cyanide. It is then said, on his instruction, their remains were taken upstairs to his garden and burned. Because of this, when the Soviet army arrived, there were some questions as to whether the charred remains were Hitler's or not. In 2009, some of the remains were tested, and it appeared that actually they belonged to a woman of 40 years old or younger, and not the Führer. This led to many conspiracists believing that he was still alive and living with a false identity. Even if this far-fetched story was true, there is almost no way that Hitler would be alive today in 2017. Born in April 1889, if Hitler were alive today, he would be 128 years old, making him the oldest man alive. Even for children born in the Second World War, they're now in their 70s. Nonetheless, if he were miraculously found alive, it is likely he wouldn't stay that way for long. Despite his age and state of health, it is probably likely that the biggest villain in modern history would be tried for his his many crimes, like other discovered Second World War criminals. Hitler's close associates Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, Hans Frank, and Alfred Jodl were all sentenced to death and executed. However, things have changed in the world since 1946, and in most places, capital punishment has been abolished. Perhaps with the miraculous discovery of Hitler, the world would call for a reintroduction, but to be honest, if a courthouse didn't pass the sentence, I am sure that an inmate would. If Hitler were to be found alive, there would be a lot of questions as to how he escaped his fate. There would also be a lot of questions posed to the Führer about why he did everything he did. He would be made to answer for his atrocities. The best thing to come from Hitler being found alive would be a final sense of justice and vindication for the victims of his cruelty. His suicide was a cheap and easy way out of having to deal with the repercussions of his actions. If Hitler were alive today, I wonder how he would feel about Germany now, and how he would feel about modern politics. I wonder how he would feel about the refugee crisis, about multicultural communities, and about certain world leaders. One can only speculate, but I would assume he would have some strong opinions and choice words. Another interpretation to this question is, what if someone like him were alive right now? Would they be able to abuse the political system to rise to the top? Would they be able to manipulate democracy in their favor so that those who spoke out against them were fired? Or, worse. Could someone like Hitler exist who is a powerful and talented speaker able to drum up an exciting rally? Could someone exist that finds a way to control the media, selecting only preferential outlets? Could someone like him exploit economic and social fears to turn one group against another? Outsiders, say, like immigrants, for their own political gain. Friends, look around. Hitler was not a godlike villain. He was an average man with above average manipulation skills. He knew how to use fear to get what he wants: power. People like him have always existed and do still exist today. I would like to say hopefully we have learned something from the past, the time wherein Hitler actually lived and carried out his atrocities. I would hope that we are able to spot the warning signs before another individual was able to act in the way he did. As they say, those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Sadly, evil doesn't always look and sound like evil. We have to be astute. We have to be aware. Only then can we spot the Hitlers that are alive and ready to strike today. Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions. Today we are continuing our war series by asking, what if Hitler was President of the United States? Of course, this question poses many problems. Hitler died in 1945, a generation far removed from our current era. And of course, Adolf Hitler was a German national and would not be eligible to be President of the United States. Instead, in this question, let us imagine that a man, like Hitler, similarly jilted by economic decline, was able to take power in America and hold on to it for more than the usual term. What would the world be like now? We will answer this question in relation to Hitler's policies around the time of his death and how these would be translated in the United States. Let's start with the good before we descend into the awful. If Hitler was leader of the United States instead of Germany, it's quite probable that the US would have won the space race even quicker. There is strong evidence to suggest that Hitler and Nazi Germany were developing their own space program over a decade before the United States started. With Hitler's focus on intergalactic exploration, perhaps we would be further down the line in discovering the answers to the universe than we are now. One of Hitler's main focuses, despite his misguided approach in the Third Reich, was the strength of his nation and his people. Somewhat like Trump's rhetoric of Make America Great Again, Hitler wanted to make Germany great again, but actually, he wouldn't have outsourced production of his propaganda hats to China. Hitler would have focused on attempting to make the United States a strong and stable economy, and would have introduced worker benefits like cars and holidays, but of course, instead of rewarding his people with Volkswagens, it would have been Fords. Speaking of cars, Hitler was a big fan of roads. A lot of American roads are in a very poor state at the moment, and if his Autobahn project was anything to go by, that wouldn't be the case if he was Prez. America is very sport-orientated as it is, and this would be much the same if Hitler was president. That said, he preferred shows of strength over ball games. Also, the commercials running would likely not be for Wild Wings or Bud Light, instead for Nazi propaganda pieces, or whatever his American equivalent would be. Speaking of wings, the diet of the American people would likely be very different. Hitler was a vegetarian, and he believed in healthier food farmed from the land, so you can kiss tinned cheese and McDonald's goodbye. If Hitler had ever got so far as to encourage his own diet on his people, it's likely that farming and dairy would not be the leading American industry it is today. Despite a number of sources discussing Hitler's peculiar sex life and his own lack of children, Hitler's regime actively encouraged family life. Hitler believed a woman's place was in the kitchen and a man should be out at at work. Of course, these ideas were shared in the civilized world in the 1960s, but with Hitler in charge of the free world, perhaps they would have hindered progression for longer. Now we reach Hitler's flawed relationship to the church. Whilst born a Christian, there is overwhelming evidence to suggest that Hitler only ever used the church as a political prop, rather like the fictitious Frank Underwood. It is thought by most historians that once his power was consolidated, he would have tried to downplay the role of church in people's lives, focusing on building support and adoration for his regime instead. So far, the picture of America seems not so bad under Hitler's rule, but here is where things get nasty. While German Hitler sought to eliminate what he called the burden of European Jewry, an American Hitler arguably would not have had the same focus. If an American-style Hitler had emerged from the right, this is speculation, but it is entirely possible that they could have taken issue with black progression and felt a sympathy with the Confederates following the Civil War. We don't know. But if American Hitler's views were as warped as German Hitler's were in regards to the Aryan race, then maybe. Suffice to say, immigration would have probably been tighter than ever. Of course, there is the Cold War, a large part of America's history. If a Hitler-like figure had ruled America rather than Germany, Russia could have been even stronger than it was when it was a restraining factor in Europe, which could have meant that the Cold War ended in hot war, and instead of the United States dropping the bomb on Japan, it could have been Russia. Of course, if American Hitler was anything like German Hitler, he would rule through fear and corruption. Remember Night of the Long Knives. Homosexuals would be targeted, as would those with disabilities, and of course those who publicly disagreed with him and his party. Hitler had no problem with killing his opposition or those who threatened his values. Think 1984, but actual 1984, some 50 years into Hitler's rule. While some aspects of Hitler's rule could have been great on the surface for America, as JFK so eloquently put it, the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. America may be a prosperous country if Hitler ruled, but it would not be free. And isn't freedom what the country was founded upon?